Generally speaking, the United States has been hailed as a leader in elevating the PCV agenda to a global international scale, as well as has developed or helped to develop PCV practices that many countries and governments continue to follow to this date. What does our PCV standing or landscape look like domestically today? The rise in new forms of political violence, right-wing, left-wing, are posing challenge to the current conventional, predominantly Muslim community-focused PCV efforts. Do such challenges put to the test the current components of PCV as we know it? Relative to our international partners, domestic CVE continue to struggle in gaining public support. In terms of available funding, the US also falls behind many of its partners and allies. Constraints affecting CT and PCV program evaluation from a conceptual, theoretical, programmatic aspect also abound. Our panelists and through the audience input will weigh on these and other themes from a policy perspective, as well as drawing from experiences rooted in social media campaigns, community level, and other engagement efforts. As a disclaimer, we will start and make reference to the term CVE or PCV, but we'll wait and see if the term is going to sustain itself or sustain the test of scrutiny, I should say, by the time we have concluded our discussion today. The format of the presentations is as follows. We will have opening remarks by our panelists, and then we'll give a brief overview of our panelist bio. But for those of you who haven't already done so, we have uploaded program agenda and extended bios of our respective panelists on our ACTRI website. Following the opening remarks, we will move on to Q&A session. That said, thanks again for your participation. At this stage, I would like to welcome Dr. Cyndia Miller Idris. Dr. Idris is a sociologist, she's an educator, she's a counterterrorism professional, a perfect blend of scholar practitioner, if you will, a mentor to many of us who are relatively new to the field of right-wing extremism as well. She's also the director of the Polarization Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERL. We might lose Dr. Idris a little bit earlier today, but don't panic, we'll make sure we get her back again. So Dr. Idris, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And actually, I was able to change my other commitment, so you have me the whole time. So I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. And great, I just wanted to give you a couple of images because of what we're working on. I thought I would just very informally share a little bit about the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in terms of a couple of the interventions we're doing right now, and then, but try to keep it brief so we have plenty of time for discussion. So thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Delighted to see so many other friends on the panel, and happy to engage however I can here. Polarization, Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERL, launched less than a year ago, so we're relatively new kids on the block, and hoping that we can provide some empirical evidence back to the field on both designing and testing some out-of-the-box ideas, but also acting as evaluation partners for some colleagues in the field who are looking for evaluation by pulling in methodologists from across the university who can contribute different types of intervention approaches and evaluation approaches. So we're testing a variety of different ideas to try to reduce rising polarization and hate, to improve resilience pre-exposure. So a lot of what we're thinking of, our work is sort of pre-PVE, but also to build more effective off-ramps to interrupt those radicalization processes at early stages. So again, those of you who know my work know that I'm interested in the starting gateways, the peripheries, the moments of entry into these kind of scenes, particularly for youth, and ways to identify those scenes and interrupt them. And so that's what we've been working on. We are testing some interventions in youth subcultural spaces, which again is in my kind of interest, doing some work with comedy and humor, with mixed martial arts, online gaming, and social media. I'm happy to talk about those. We have 2 tests underway with video-based inoculations, one in race science and male supremacy, and we're working on one in vaccine hesitancy. And we're testing a number of intervention tools for parents and caregivers, teachers, mental health counselors, and coaches, as well as some cross-national research that we've just wrapped up with Germany, where I've done most of my work over the years. So I wanted to share a couple of those tools that have already come out that we now have in impact studies in pre and post test survey. So we should have results. We just got ethical approval for one of them to run the study, which will launch next week. And the other one, we're still waiting back from the panel, but those will be launching this fall. So together with the Southern Poverty Law Center, we are launching a series of toolkits. The first one was for parents and caregivers, which we released over the summer. It is called Building Resilience and Confronting Risk in the COVID-19 Era. It's about 18 pages long. It offers parents and caregivers who we decided to focus on first because of the fact that about 90 to 100 million young people, 25 and under, are sitting at home online almost all the time. 70 million home from K to 12 in college, and then a number of other young people not in the college or high school systems who are just spending extraordinary amounts of time online. We know that the risks are up. The 7 million reports higher on the child exploitation reports online right now, for example, over last year. So we know that we've seen these reports. I don't think I need to convince this group of the risks of spending that much time online, but trying to help parents and caregivers who are understandably overwhelmed with the situation, often letting their children spend much more time online than they would otherwise, even when they're not in school, or out of the home working while their kids are at home alone online. And so trying to help parents and caregivers understand the warning signs, but also develop some strategies with parenting consultants we worked with and residential therapists who live with adolescents advised us on this as well. Strategies for conversation, for confronting and building kind of some of the more positive identity-based approaches to reducing vulnerabilities. So we've been doing a webinar series. The one that ran this week, we had over 1,100 people register. There is obviously a ton of interest and need among parents and caregivers and teachers for information in this area. So we're repeating that webinar again because of interest on November 12th, and then we'll run 2 for the mental health community in December. Again, our impact study, which is launching, and we have the toolkit expanding. So this is the first guide, and there'll be a series of other toolkits, including a web portal coming out over the next year. All of these resources are free. You can download them at our website or at the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. And eventually we'll be building our own web portal linked between the two so folks can get those resources, including some videos. Just a couple of examples of some of the slides that what some of the information helps provide parents and caregivers, information on how online spaces work, how offline spaces work. We talk through also some strategies for building resilience and prevention, again, that came out of work that we did with residential therapists in terms of how to strengthen identity, but also what happens if you observe it, what is the risk in reporting, and what are some ways to report credible threats, but also help strengthen a sense of reduce fear and uncertainty among children who experience it. Second product that I'm really proud of that we just released this week is an education guide for teachers and college faculty to accompany an animated video that we produced together with the Bertelsmann Foundation. It's an 11-minute animated video on the Boogaloo scenes and groups that is focused on how misinformation and disinformation contributes to anti-government militia radicalization and mobilization. Really professional, great animators worked on it. I really encourage you to watch it. The entire webinar that we ran to release the guide is now up on YouTube with the animated video embedded. The education guide was written for us by a high school teacher and a college faculty member who designed discussion questions, exercises to help young people and middle school and high school and college age students understand what conspiracy theories look like, how you can fact check them, even, but not necessarily focused initially on anti-government extremism, but on things like birds aren't real, they're all drones. I mean, these are existing conspiracy theories that kids can kind of wrap their heads around and then introduce the ideas. There's also discussion questions to accompany the video and a glossary, a lot of background information on anti-government extremism and militia mobilization in general. All again set in the context of an animated video. This is a still shot from the video telling the fictionalized account of a man named Henry Graves who stumbles on some misinformation, ends up being recruited into a violent Boogaloo scene and eventually gets out. So this is the one we just got the ethical approval to run the impact study with 500 people who will watch the video and do a pre and post test to see whether and how this changes their ideas about what misinformation and disinformation looks like and how it might contribute to anti-government militia radicalization, including COVID-19 misinformation, which is a part of this story. The last thing I'll say is we're also undertaking a number of public outreach activities that don't actually have research components. The one that I would just want to highlight is a podcast jointly created with the Anti-Defamation League. We now have 6 episodes out, and a number of you on this call probably will be reached out to by Oren Siegel, who's our host for the podcast. It features interviews so far with Heidi Barich, Eric Ward from Western States, Kathy Blee, Vidya Ramalingam from Moonshot, a number of others, Seamus Hughes, folks who work in this field, talking both about their work, how they got into extremism, but also kind of how they cope with the work they do in terms of their own mental health. So we're hoping that this will contribute to students and the younger generation also understanding how one works in this field and what some of the risks and rewards are of doing this kind of work. I'm going to stop there just because I think that's enough to wrap people's heads around, but just to say that the work that we're trying to do is come up with interesting ideas, work more on the peripheries of the field, adults, community members, young people at the margins who are entering these scenes in new ways and unusual ways, see whether and how we can interrupt those using a lot of visual-based methods as well, like video-based inoculation with Kurt Braddock is our advisor on that at American. And most importantly, hopefully providing evidence back to the field, research-driven evidence that will, we hope within the next couple of months, start having the first results for everyone, help move the needle on what we know on the empirical sense in ways that might be scalable. So look forward to comments and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Idris. I appreciate that. I hope we can maybe later in the program go a little bit more into the methodology and try to understand how do we actually measure the impact of all this communication activities. How do we measure them as well? So I hope you can share at some point with us as well. Thank you so much. So our next panelist is Mr. Eric Rossand. Again, I apologize for the shortened versions of your bios, but again, for those of you who just in, we're going to have the more extended bios already on our website as well. Mr. Rossand is the director of the Prevention in your Fellow Brookings Institution Project on U.S. Relation with the Islamic Forum. From January 2010 to March 2016, Mr. Rossand was a senior official in the U.S. Department of State working on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. Thank you, Mr. Rossand, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And no, I'm not sitting in front of all the books that I've written or read. It's not a real bookshelf. But thank you very much for inviting me in for this interesting themed event. And I think it's a nice counterpoint to Cynthia's presentation, because I'm sort of going to look at these issues from a maybe slightly broader perspective, and trying to understand a bit why, despite all the great things that our DHS colleagues spoke about earlier and all the interesting initiatives that Cynthia and her team are pursuing, that countering violent extremism, or whatever you want to call it, has such a bad reputation in this country. And why are we still struggling with so many of the issues that so many of our Western partners and allies have moved beyond? So I think I'll focus a bit on that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that despite the fact that the U.S. is, for the most part, considered the global leader when it comes to counterterrorism, it's a backbencher at best when it comes to countering violent extremism. And there have been significant efforts over the last few years, and I would actually commend DHS in this regard, at least below the leadership level at this on this regard, in adjusting to some of these critiques and moving away from the perception that it's focused on only a single form of violent extremism, although it took them quite a bit of time to do that, as the threat level around right-wing, in particular, violent white supremacist extremism was rising. They have pivoted towards a terrorism prevention, targeted violence framework that, at least on paper, should assuage concerns about it being too narrowly focused. They have reconstituted a lot of the structures that were initially eviscerated by the Trump administration when it came in. So we're more or less back to where things were in 2016, with a little bit of a broader focus, explicit broader focus on all forms of violent extremism. But we wasted a lot of time in the process. And I think you take sort of the steps that DHS has undertaken, which again deserve to be commended, but then you match that against what other agencies in the US government, in what's supposed to be a whole of government, whole of society approach to these issues domestically, what they've done over the last few years, and it's next to nothing. And I think it's remarkable that despite the US still going around the world talking about the need for comprehensive national CVE frameworks to underpin all these wonderful programs that countries are now developing and are being developed here, that we don't have a national framework here. We have a DHS framework. We don't have a White House framework. We don't have an interagency framework. And I think so it's wonderful to hear about all the references that DHS is making to mental health professionals, to teachers and the like, but it would be great to have the Department of Education and Health and Human Services speaking from the same song sheet and actually projecting this whole of federal government approach. And I think it still leads to even though DHS's heart is definitely in the right place, it does lead to a perception that this is still, from a federal level, securitized. And I think that perception is only exacerbated when you see, again, not in the quote unquote CVE or targeted violence prevention space, but in other areas where DHS is involved in that have attracted a lot of controversy and a lot of concern from communities around the country, that it's difficult, I think, for DHS to be continuing to lead in the space over the long term, given these other sensitive issues that DHS is frankly screwing up. And I think this again argues for a much more holistic approach from the federal level and more political leadership, or any political leadership from the White House. And I think, again, one of the lessons learned over the years in the international CVE arena, and one of the good practices that, again, the US internationally supports, is that there needs to be political leadership on this agenda domestically. It goes without saying there's next to none, if not negative, leadership on this agenda in the United States currently from the White House. So again, it leaves one scratching one's head. Okay, internationally, the US is still projecting this, promoting these good practices, but domestically, it's not adhering to them. And that again leaves some scratching their heads. So apart from the lack of political leadership and apart from the lack of a comprehensive national framework that is whole of society, whole of government in its ethos, there is still no coordinating mechanism in place, even at the federal level, to sort of connect the dots and to allow the great work, for example, that Cyndia is doing through a university and through her partners, to allow that to be synced up to what government actors are doing at the state, local, and federal level, to have her expertise and that of her colleagues infusing the thinking on a systematic basis at the federal level and the state level at the government of government. And again, you go to Canada, you go to Australia, you go to different countries in Europe, they have those structures in place to allow for the sort of multidisciplinary, multi-layered level interactions that, again, are considered international good practice. In fact, the US was one of the leading champions of this new Global Counterterrorism Forum Good Practices document that was just adopted in September in New York, or not virtually adopted by the Global Counterterrorism Forum, about national local cooperation in preventing and countering violent extremism. And a lot of the principles in there are not being followed by the US government at home in terms of how the national actors should interact with the local actors in a much more bottom-up, systematic, sustained way. And I would just argue that apart from the programming that's now starting to emerge, again, a lot of it organically, a lot of the DHS grants that are being, the funding that's coming out now is going to initiatives that were already underway that had sort of emerged despite the federal government rather than because of the federal government. And now, to its credit, DHS is supporting them, sustaining and helping to scale those up. And it's starting to move very much in the direction of some of our Western colleagues and partners, focusing much more on individual interventions, whether in the secondary or tertiary prevention space, which had been huge gaps in the US domestic CVE architecture. But I would argue that the biggest gap is still is the trust issue. And I think we, no matter how many innovative programs that are going to come out, no matter how much money is going to be injected into this space, unless the underlying trust issues between communities and the government and law enforcement and the White House, frankly, can be addressed, I think the sustainability of all this is going to be in question. The good news is that, and I'll end with, is that we know what to do. We know where to head because the US government has been promoting this internationally for a number of years now. And it just needs to follow the roadmap that it's been laying out for others. You need a comprehensive strategy that's whole of government, whole of society, political leadership from the executive branch, the White House. You need to avoid pushing this down from the top. You need to have a lot more bottom-up, community-based, community-infused initiatives that the federal government is supporting. You need to make sure that when you are developing a strategy, which doesn't exist, that it's infused again by local actors, local voices, local experiences, and it's not driven by a national security agency. It's driven by either the White House, if it's the right messaging from the White House, or some other non-security element, so that it gives the right message to the country about what this is about, what this is really about. It is as much about security as about protecting our communities and safeguarding our kids and everything. And then I will just conclude by saying that again, there's much to be commended in what DHS is doing, the direction it's heading. I just wish that it could be supported by other agencies as partners in this space, whether it's in the health, education, even labor side, and with a messaging from the political leadership that is very supportive and creates an environment that's conducive to all the progress that DHS is making to it actually being sustainable and a starting point for overcoming some of the barriers to trust that, again, have just been exacerbated over the last few years. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the other panelists and to hopefully some questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Rossano. Appreciate that. To those of us who have been following your work closely, you've been indeed critical and have reflected actually critically on both of the CVE under President Obama as well as President Trump. So there's lessons learned that we can kind of maybe transition to future administration as well. So we look forward to getting maybe with other question with that respect as well. So now I would welcome Brett Steele. She serves as the Director of Prevention and National Security at McCain Institute for International Leadership. Prior to joining McCain Institute, Ms. Steele served as the Regional Director of the Strategic Engagement for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnership. In that role, she advised the state of California in the development of statewide preventing violent extremism strategy and partnered with counties, cities, and nonprofit organizations to develop and implement preventing violent extremism programs. Ms. Steele, thank you again for your presence and participation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adrian and Mohammed, for having me today. And I'm delighted to be on this panel with several old friends and some new. One additional aspect of my bio is I was Deputy Director of the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force that strove to do the very type of work that Eric was just referencing. So doing the direct outreach with the Department of Education, with the Department of Health and Human Services, with the Department of Labor, and made some initial inroads there. It's extraordinarily hard to forge and really institutionalize those partnerships without strong leadership from the top. And so that it is a challenge, it's an ongoing challenge, and it requires leadership up and down the line to really institutionalize those partnerships over time. I wanted to very briefly, I recognize we're running very long and there are several panelists left to speak. So very briefly, talk through 3 of the initiatives we have running at the McCain Institute, and then one related evaluation to echo some of the themes that you heard earlier from Cyndia. So at the McCain Institute, our work on prevention follows 3 primary lines of effort. The first line of effort is policy development. Here, we're partnering with the Center for American Progress to develop a comprehensive and actionable policy blueprint for countering violent white supremacy in the United States. This is a year-long project where we're convening different stakeholder groups, really across society, to get policy recommendations for countering violent white supremacy in the United States, and frankly, red lines, what people don't think their community would accept, what they couldn't get behind. Many of the efforts to address violent white supremacy, especially in the United States Congress, have run into hurdles along the way, especially with whether it's privacy and civil liberties advocacy groups pushing back, potentially counterterrorism officials pushing back. And so the goal is to really get a bipartisan consensus of actionable reforms that can be implemented at the outset of the next Congress. Our second line of effort is capacity building. And this speaks to some of what Eric was talking about. We're really trying to build a network of practitioners providing direct prevention and intervention services addressing hate and targeted violence throughout the United States. This will be a forum for subject matter experts like Cyndia to share her research with the practitioners doing this work on the ground across the country. This is funded by the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. Our goal of the network is to synthesize the latest research, share promising practices on program design, and facilitate that sustained collaboration among practitioners so that they really have the opportunity to learn from one another. We're hosting 12 workshops over the next 2 years. 9 workshops will be virtual for the next year of COVID travel restrictions, and then we'll have 3 in-person workshops the following year. And ultimately what we're trying to build is an asset map of prevention and intervention professionals who are willing to accept referrals across the United States. Because those are the calls that I get on a regular basis is, there's an individual who needs services in Tampa, Florida. What programs are available there? Especially, and we'll hear from Brett in a minute, different Brett in a minute, you know, as there are national level hotlines, it really helps to have some local level services that you can refer to as well, and ensuring that all of the services have the cultural competency to handle these cases, as well as the trauma-informed training as necessary. Our third line of effort, and frankly, probably the one people have heard most about, is innovation. And right now we have running the peer-to-peer protective project in 10 universities across the country. And this, many people may know, is the peer-to-peer challenging extremism project. That was its original form, which was a partnership between the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and Adventure Partners. Now it's the McCain Institute and Adventure Partners delivering this program in 10 universities. We have students designing incredible apps, video games, you name it. They're tackling white supremacy in gaming. They're tackling hate crimes targeting LGBTQ students on campus, and really everything in between. And it's been a fun program to work with. Next semester, we will actually be scaling that program to 25 universities in the United States through a contract with the Department of Homeland Security. I want to close just with some evaluation results. This was Elena Savoya out of the Harvard University Chan School of Public Health did an evaluation of the prior peer-to-peer challenging extremism project. It was a longitudinal cohort study with control groups and randomized trials. How frequently do you hear those words in this space? They studied over 1,000 students. They found that 4 out of 10 students had experienced unsafe situations online. And they found that a student designed campaign, this campaign in particular was Combat Kindness, student designed campaign had an impact on reduction of exposure to hate messages in middle school students and improved attitudes of tolerance in high school students. So they did find a measurable impact in that randomized control study last year. So I will close there. Obviously, we need a lot more evaluation along the way. We're excited that our practitioners network that we're building through the DHS grant will also be evaluated, and using that network to get evaluation results out to the practitioners who need them most. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Steele, I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing what appears to be more promising empirical methodologies when it comes to trying to measure the effectiveness of PCV measures as well. So thank you for sharing with us. So the next panelist is Ms. Leanne Ardberg-Stedman. She's the Director of Violent Extremism at the United States Institute of Peace, where she leads work on preventing and countering violent extremism, including overseeing the Resolve Network, a global research consortium, as well as a senior advisor to the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States. Prior to joining the Institute, Ms. Leanne served in the U.S. government at the National Security Council staff at the White House, the Department of State, and the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you again, Ms. Stedman, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thank you to you all for organizing this. Thanks to the other panelists. Nice to see so many friendly faces. So given that the U.S. Institute of Peace primarily operates outside of the United States, I think my value add here comes from both the global evolution of PE and CVE efforts and also the unique perspectives of peace building. We are exploring a wider humanistic lens to better prevent violent extremism by getting a better understanding of individuals, of groups, and of systems. So just quickly for me, I have found that American psychologist Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs has helped me get back to basics on PCVE conversations. So Maslow famously said that all humans have this hierarchy of needs, at the bottom being your physiological needs like food and water, then you have safety needs. After that, you move up the hierarchy to your needs for love and belonging, and eventually self-esteem and self-actualization. The reason that I come back to this for basics is when you think of the opportunism of violent extremist organizations, they purport to answer whatever your need is. At the very bottom, in the most conflict-affected spaces, and then at the very top in the comfort at your computer in your home spaces. And they tailor their message to answer whatever is your deficiency and needs. So we see in countless contexts, recruiters are able to take people from all walks of life and bring them into a radical narrative that at its most basic sense says your status quo is broken and we can provide you with something better. perhaps without knowing it, I see how these violent extremist organizations operate on 3 very different levels, and they all are starting to have much more scientific understanding of how we can do better preventing and countering. The first level is the individual level, the second I see as a group level, and the third being structural. So at an individual level, we have more and more research from neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, and others who've come to find that there are these things called sacred values. These are moral values that are non-negotiable and inviolable. And so basically the idea behind a sacred value, it's something that you're not negotiating under any circumstances. They can be religious, and we've seen this for like anti-blasphemy, but they also can be secular. Things like democracy can be a sacred value. Often these are associated with what you're willing to fight or die for. And the reason that I'm highlighting this concept of sacred values is they are processed in a different part of your brain than cost-benefit analysis. So there's no convincing people with logical arguments. And neuroscientists have seen this when they put violent extremists into an MRI scanner. But the individual level is only one component of how people come to violent extremism. And so the next level that we see a lot of violent extremist groups capitalize on is a group identity. So there are countless sociological studies, and plenty of people, including on this call, are a lot smarter than I am on this, but they show that people are willing to do things in groups that they would be unwilling to do alone. And frankly, this is very understandable, because we all do things in groups, regardless of whether on an individual basis, we'd be willing to do it. I think this is an incredibly important level of understanding participation in the group beyond just joining. Lastly, I think that the structural level is something that we can highlight more and more, especially as we see the patterns of widespread polarization and hate across the globe. Because all over the world, there are trends that are simply outside of your individual ability to impact. There are systemic issues that will take collective action. And so violent extremist groups that claim to provide system-wide answers have an additional level of appeal. So this only scratches the surface. I'm trying to be quick in respect for all of the time for this panel, but I think it starts to illuminate how radicalization is both a complex system. It has a lot of idiosyncratic interactions among the cognitive levels and social levels and structural dynamics. It is very, very context driven, both the context of an individual and the context of the environment. So at USIP, we've been exploring a couple things that I think might be useful to detail. The first is whether or not nonviolent civic resistance can feed some of the same psychosocial, group level, and structural level needs that violent extremists purport to do. So can nonviolent civic resistance answer collective action calls to change on the structural level aspects while providing a group and the bonds of belonging that only happen when you struggle together? We're also trying to see if nonviolent civil resistance fills some of those individual level characteristics regarding sacred values that you believe to be inviolable, like freedom or dignity or liberty. Another thing that the Institute has been doing that might be of interest, we call violent extremist disengagement and reconciliation, a terrible acronym we call VADER, but we figured that acronyms help things stick. And it highlights peace building's vital role in reconciling people who disengage from violent extremism, but also reifies the value of a community. It treats violent extremism as a form of violent conflict that has a social and behavioral nature, but it also draws on practices from other types of social challenges like cult disaffiliation and gang and removing yourself from gangs, but it also is looking to literature such as leaving a long-time job or abusive relationship. These frameworks are trying to help go beyond just an individual rehabilitating and actually address an entire social ecology to help lower barriers to help-seeking behavior and open those community spaces for pro-social interaction. At USIP, and this is mentioned in my bio, but I'll maybe end with this, we also run the Resolve Network, which is a consortium of researchers, research organizations, policymakers, and practitioners. And we're committed to better research, informing practice, and improved policy. And several of today's esteemed panelists, both on this panel and on the ones following, are Resolve organizational members and individual experts. And so as part of that effort, we are tackling a lot of research to help make sure that it informs informs policymakers and programs directly. And we do have a new line of research on nationalist, xenophobic, and white supremacist violent extremism, which we are borrowing the terminology from the State Department as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. And while Resolve's research is focused outside of the United States, it's specifically to explore those global connections that have become more visible, more prominent, and more intertwined. So given the time and the speed at which I've probably been talking too fast, I'm going to stop there for now, but I'm looking forward to learning more from the additional panelists, and then also if we have any time for questions and answers. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stedman. Appreciate that. I wish we could go individual and deconstruct many of the great components that you have mentioned, but hopefully this is a food for our future discussion, hopefully as well. So our next panelist is Mr. Brett Jacobson. He comes from he's a program coordinator for Exit USA. The organization has been doing a great job in the way of public awareness campaigns, individualized education, strategic communication, partnerships, and so on. Mr. Jacobson is a licensed social worker in Illinois with case management and mental health counseling experience in the prison system. His desire to help people springs from his time in the Illinois Army National Guard while on a deployment for Operation Iraqi Freedom. I heard that Mr. Brett Jacobson went to NIU. It did not go to Northwestern, but we'll keep it at that, and maybe we can continue in the future. Thank you, Mr. Brett. Your conversation, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Adrian, and Assalamu alaikum, Mohammed. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I'm very honored to be among such great colleagues. Even though the books behind you are fake, Cynthia and Eric, I'm very jealous, and I really do hope to have my office looking like that in the near future. So I will be very brief because I do like to have a discussion going forward. I'll just give some quick overview of Life After Hate. Life After Hate was founded in 2011 at a conference dealing with prevention of violence of a bunch of former white supremacists, and they were talking and they realized that their process of exiting this ideology and this violence would have been a lot easier had they had someone to talk to throughout the process. And so that is how Life After Hate was born. We are committed to helping people leave violent far right and to connect them with humanity and lead compassionate lives. Our vision is for a world that allows people to change and contribute to a society without violence. We have a belief that hateful ideology is not a prerequisite for joining these groups, and that there are many other factors, including alienation, trauma, shame, and abuse, that lead people into these groups, which I think has been touched on a little bit. Individuals are more likely to leave a hate group if they feel they have an alternate community to support them. And I think that is one of the great strengths of Life After Hate, is connecting people who are trying to leave these groups with someone who has done it, and provide that mentorship and show them that there is hope, because that exit process is extremely difficult for the individuals attempting it. It is lonely, and loneliness increases the likelihood of relapse. And pairing somebody with someone who has shown that this is possible is going to lessen the chance of that relapse. We also recognize that formers are a credible voice, and it's changed the process of other extremists. One of the things that Life After Hate has been doing is expanding and moving beyond just formers helping formers, and involving a more professionalized model. And that's where people like myself come in. I started out as a volunteer, as a mental health professional, to be able to assist formers, helping other formers, recognizing some of those mental health issues that might be going on, that the former might not have the skills or the training to recognize and address. So the Exit USA program, which I currently am the supervisor of, we operate at a highly developed and empathetic format. We provide around-the-clock tailored support, education, and referral services to ensure people can build new, more fulfilling lives free from hate. Our work is safely implemented virtually and is completely anonymous and confidential. And that ties into this trust issue of, we need to make sure that people who are leaving these movements trust us, because if they don't trust us, they're not going to seek out help. Many of the people we work with, they could be working for short-term times, offering advice and support, or it could be a long-term support, 2-3 years sometimes. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Brett. I appreciate that. My apologies. I was just notified that Brett's current position is the program supervisor for the Exit USA. So I apologize for the misstatement as well. Okay, so at this point, maybe we could go to some of the questions that we have received from the audience. And again, I'm going to throw these questions out there, and any of you, you're welcome to respond as deemed appropriate as well. So the first question that we had from the audience is the role of family in reducing violent extremism and in building and empowering community resilience. What policies align and support the family on the basis of building, as a basis of building block of the society? So I would also maybe throw a additional, maybe add-on question. How, and this is something that's reflecting on what Dr. Idris has published recently, some of her work, that how do we de-radicalize our parents as well? So when we see them being not necessarily explicitly embracing violent extremist ideology, but not also showing resilience towards ideology, whether it's on social media or offline as well. So maybe Dr. Millers, we could start with you first.
Sure, this is a very appropriate question since I'm sitting in my dad's basement, which is why you're seeing the background of my office book photo instead of the ironing board in the basement where I'm actually sitting, one of the joys of virtual life. So I field a lot of questions from parents. I would say they are generally the most heartbreaking questions I get when and I'm sure anyone on this call feel the same way, because by the time parents finding me online, just a regular professor, they're really desperate. And it's often too late. And so one of the reasons I think why we wanted to build this Parents and Caregivers Guide is to really try to help parents at every level understand the needs to intervene with all young people, essentially, like not once you're seeing extreme warning signs, not once there's already a gun purchased and you're calling the police to find out whether that's legal, but at a much, much earlier stage when they're entering online gaming platforms and you know that a quarter of them are going to encounter white supremacist extremist propaganda, for example. So trying to help them understand those risks and build the resilience at an earlier stage. But as you were saying, this summer I started fielding questions for the first time about how to help teenagers with their parents who are radicalizing into QAnon for the most part, QAnon and other conspiracy theories, which is a whole different set of questions because you're dealing with minors who have then lost their own, they're safe adults essentially. And so it's a really different set of advice that we're giving to young people than to their parents. And I think for young people, our advice is to find some other trusted adults. Basically, you have to expand your circle, and we're urging also, that's why it's important, I think, to also think about it as caregivers, right? So we're encouraging both young people to think about their aunts and their uncles and their grandparents and their teachers, their coaches, anybody else in their life who they can seek out help and advice from, but also asking those people to think about the children and the young people in their lives, not only in terms of the risk that young people are exposed to propaganda, misinformation, or extremist content, but also that their parents now might be, as we know, increasingly experiencing anti-government extremism, anti-vax kinds of conspiracy theories, and QAnon conspiracy theories rapidly growing among a more middle-aged population. So it's a kind of see something, say something, but within the family and broader caregivers kind of unit, and then trying to find resources. And I think that's why we had 1,100 people sign up for this webinar with virtually no advertising. I mean, we really did not promote it very heavily, and we're blown away by that interest just on a regular, Wednesday night, on an evening night. And so there is a tremendous need, there is a tremendous interest, and the main thing, I think the main message is that it takes more than a parent and it takes more than a single teacher, but it's an entire network of people reaching out and understanding for every young person in their lives, grandparents, aunts, uncles, teachers, employers, anyone who's working with a young person, to think about the vulnerabilities, their exposure, but also what's happening with the other adults in their life. So I'll stop there just because I know we don't have that much time. But
thank you, Dr. Mills. Appreciate your insight. So the second question that we have it goes to Mr. Rosan. He earlier mentioned that there is no currently comprehensive national, whether it's on terrorism or targeting violence prevention framework. Could you elaborate a little bit what could be done in that sense, and whatever the how do we align our comprehensive national frameworks with international frameworks, such as those stipulated by UN and other organizations as well? And maybe if you could, earlier you stressed a little bit about how a lot of focus has been put on primary intervention, so to speak, but much less on secondary and tertiary as well. If you could expand a little bit what that means in practice to those who are not necessarily new to CVE field.
Sure. On the first part of the very good question, I mean, it basically involves an effort to bring the different parts of the government together, and Brett Steele, obviously, they certainly were starting to do this in the Obama administration, to bring the different parts of the government together, law enforcement, non-law enforcement, bring in state actors, bring in municipalities, bring in civil society, and actually run a consultative process that informs the development of this comprehensive strategy that looks at sort of both the programmatic efforts that need to be supported, as well as the policy framework that needs to underpin it all. Canada is a good example of a country that a federal system that ran such a process a few years ago. It was I think a full year, if not more, consultative process where led by the federal government, but it involved going to all the Canadian provinces, consulting with all the major cities and communities, having online sort of questionnaires for communities to fill out, asking what communities want from the federal government in terms of addressing these issues, what communities think are the issues to be addressed, what are the threats of most concern to the communities around the larger basket of extremist violence. Anyway, there's a great example up north that we could easily turn to if there's political will. I think the issue is political will, not how to do it. And I do think that there are some issues about getting the non-law enforcement actors at the federal level invested in this, in part because of a lot of the potholes on the CVE road that have formed as a result of some missteps here and there involving the federal government and communities, and some misperceptions, frankly, from communities and sort of stereotyping by communities of what the federal government motives are. So all of that needs to be addressed. I think starting with a targeted violence prevention framework is a great start. I just think it needs to come from a broader vantage point than just the Department of Homeland Security as sort of the gateway to this conversation with communities around the country. The second part of or your second question about secondary and tertiary prevention, essentially, primary prevention is engaging at a community level, not with individuals who are at risk of or already committed to violence, but just sort of sensitizing the community on these issues, trying to build community resilience, social cohesion around issues of extremist violence. A lot of what the community awareness briefings are part of that we heard in the beginning. That's part of primary prevention. And secondary prevention is basically when you're dealing with people who have not yet crossed the criminal threshold. They are showing signs of radicalization to violence, and there needs to be some form, or there should be some form of targeted individual intervention to steer them on a peaceful path. Tertiary intervention is for people who have either already committed a crime or in jail, have been convicted of a terrorist offense and need to be rehabilitated or reintegrated, or those who have not gone to jail but have already sort of shown a commitment to violence, and they need to be steered away. And we've been really good in this country. It's because it's easier, frankly, to do primary prevention work. The more challenging pieces have been engaging at an individual level, because that's really where the trust in communities comes into play, because you need communities that are willing to refer individuals to local authorities for these kinds of interventions. And with the police so actively involved in a lot of these CVE efforts over the years, or too actively involved, much less so now, and perception that this is all sort of surveilling communities and targeting certain Muslim communities, it's been very difficult to get community members to have any trust in these kinds of intervention programs, and they just have never been resourced and never been support for them in Congress, et cetera. So it's great to see that now we've moved beyond this a little bit. I'm not sure how much support there is in Muslim communities for this kind of work, frankly, but we'll see. I'm not sure how much support there is in Congress from both the Democrats and the Republicans for this. We'll see. But at least there'll be now programs that have been piloted, there'll be more evidence to show whether this is working or not working, what are the risks and what are the successes, and it'll make the US quote unquote CVE efforts much more on par in terms of the scope with what the UK, the Dutch, the Scandinavians, the Australians, and the Canadians, and the Germans have been doing for quite some time.
Thank you, Mr. Rossan. I appreciate that. Maybe as a follow-up question in reference to some of the things that Mr. Rossan mentioned with regards to secondary and tertiary preventions. Mr. Jacobson, you're familiar and you have worked, you're familiar with the treatment alternative for safer communities, or TASC that kind of, it's functioned within the criminal justice system to obtain referrals and try to actually reduce recidivism when it comes to community safety and so on. It is my understanding that these programs are sometimes implemented in a post-plea or pre-sentencing stage, and of course they exempt certain categories of felony charges as well. But is it something that could be implemented and is being implemented in the realm when it comes to individuals who are exhibiting some kind of extremism or tendencies towards violent extremism?
Yeah, so I'm definitely very grateful for my time working with TASC. In Illinois, TASC was a very large nonprofit organization where nationally TASC also can be a model. But I did work for an organization that the model was their mission, right? The prison I worked at had a very unique aspect where the entire prison was 100% drug treatment. Every inmate there was receiving treatment from a third-party organization. The idea is if you treat the addiction, you're gonna reduce the likelihood of criminal activity when they are released. But there's a lot more that goes on to addressing recidivism, treating the addiction, treating lack of job skills, social skills, all those type of things. And so the idea of providing services to the inmate before and after they leave will help reduce that recidivism. What we're currently doing with Life After Hate, I think, follows in that same kind of spirit. In addition to linking the person up with a mentor, someone like I mentioned, to just kind of walk them through the process. We also are now starting to address yeah, you're struggling with this de-radicalization, trying to purge your mind of these ideas. But on top of that, you're dealing with a drinking problem. You're dealing with possibly marital issues, all of which this person would have regardless of their ideology. And so talking about those issues and maybe not addressing it there, but making referrals outside to the community to help that individual address all those needs, I think is what we are trying to do by addressing those needs. And if I could just make one comment on the first question that Dr. Idris addressed. We also are seeing a lot of family members reach out to us as well. This year, we have had almost 100 family members or friends reach out to Life After Hate looking for assistance, advice, support. And we are now starting to offer that to them as well. And I do want you to know, Dr. Idris, that you're the guide, the parent guide, that is something that we are sharing. And so it is being put to use, and it is very, very helpful to these family members.
Thank you, Brett. Appreciate that. I appreciate your input as well. Again, apologize, we don't have much time to get into details. So the next question that we have, perhaps Ms. Stedman could take that, given it's more international in context, but also it has a domestic implication as well. As we know, the United States has recently repatriated over 20 US citizens for whom charges of providing material support or involvement with ISIS have been proven. The US has been outspoken also about the issue of repatriation of children and women, especially Mr. Eric Rozan in some of his writing has specifically explicitly stated that the issue of repatriation is our opportunity to actually show that PCV might work. So what is being done in this context in terms of again the repatriation, and what is the role of the US beside the moral role? Also, what is the ability of the US to influence other governments to deal with the issue of repatriation?
Yeah, so the simple answer to the question is we're not doing enough. I think that there are a lot of things that governments can be doing to try and facilitate what has been an ignored challenge in the middle of the Syrian desert, which is a increasing humanitarian and security imperative. The United States actually has been, on its own side, has actually taken back almost all of its citizens from there. And so there at least deserves to be kudos given for at least taking people back. But taking people back is only one part of this challenge. You have a long-term aspect of both helping an individual disengage. They may already have disengaged. To be frank, a lot of people leave violent extremist movements on their own volition for a variety of ordinary reasons. And there's some really good research on how people get dissatisfied with leadership. They get disillusioned by the fight. There's a lot of ordinary reasons why people are willing to leave violent extremist groups, but it doesn't mean that everybody does. And as Brett was just saying, the plethora of mental health challenges, whether they're ones that are endemic to a more Western context, or if they're mental health challenges that are pretty born out of a trauma-filled existence for several years within a conflict zone, there's going to be a lot of help-seeking behavior that we can be encouraging. But it's not just on the individual's shoulders to become a productive member of society, it's also on society's shoulders to try and figure out if there's a place for individuals. And I think that a reconciliation and restoration mindset is something that's really difficult in a lot of criminal justice oriented places. The idea that we are not just retributive, we're not just trying to punish people for the crimes that they have once committed, but there actually is the idea of a future that is not solely defined by the past, that there is a possibility of redemption, restoration, and reconciliation, and that communities have to be part of. There is a high stigmatization of violent extremists by communities on some level, and for good reason. People don't want to live next door to the formerly violent. People don't necessarily trust them, and there are probably fears, both founded and unfounded, regarding recidivism. But does mean that there are well-known ways that we can be applying what we've learned from post-conflict reconciliation to this challenge. A lot of peace building, senses of justice and accountability through alternative mechanisms, but frankly, a lot of trust building and just a rehumanization of individuals in the eyes of society. As to the second question as to how this can be encouraged by more and more countries, I'll kind of refer back to what Eric said, that like there are matters of political will, and in the complex worlds of lots of different diplomatic imperatives, I think that we perhaps have more to do to make this much more of an imperative. The last thing I'll say is that the more we see this as a solvable challenge, the more that imperative ends up being a little bit easier. If you assume that everybody who's going to be returning is going to be a problem, then it's going to be a hard problem for governments to accept. If you can show that most people who are returning are not going to be a problem by building up a lot of those strengths and resiliencies and buying down the risk by having the right types of programs, then you may be able to see a little bit more opportunity to make some of those political will challenges a little bit easier.
Thank you, Ms. Stedman, for trying to make sense of what it is a complex issue for many nations as well. So we're going to go to the last question, and I'm going to put this for Dr. Miller Idris, but also for Ms. Steele. So maybe we could, it's going to be in a way, it's sort of a loaded question, but I apologize for that. This kind of draws from the experience that we've been having at our center, but also in discussion with other researchers as well. So the basic elements of the radicalization process are very similar for right-wing and jihadist extremist groups. Both Salafi Islamists and right-wing precepts or doctrines promote ideas that are violent. For example, the idea of white supremacy in and of itself is violent, though not necessarily punishable in the context of terrorist activity or in the context of court of law. In our research experience, both offline and online, we find that finding militant jihadi adherents or sympathizers is much easier compared to right-wing extremists, for example, because they already operate by a common set of principles or the way they propagate their ideas. So, you know, Tawheed, Takfir, Jihad, the provision of Quran, and so on. These are some of the things that we don't necessarily have time to go to. So when we talk about right-wing extremist groups, they do not represent a homogeneous entity or idea, as there's dozens of denomination or subgroups within the right-wing umbrella, so to speak. If we, for example, look at the religion, there's much emphasis on religion or the appeal of religion when it comes to militant jihadi groups. In contrast, in right-wing extremist groups, example, if you look at the white supremacy, it does carry this anti-ethnic, Islamophobic overtone, but it remains Christian only in terms of global or cultural appeal, not necessarily this religious appeal. Well, you know, one could also argue that, well, KKK's ideology is rooted in Christianity, but it doesn't necessarily hold case across groups and denominations within the right-wing extremism that we find online. Another thing that we look at the prevention or through the lens of the CVE, that we find that with the right-wing extremist groups, we're facing difficulties with the targeting criteria in relation or in contrast to what we've done when, for example, targeting militant jihadi groups. The group within the right-wing extremisms, they're much broader. It's much more difficult to reach out to. A lot of their ideas that are espoused have, you know, gone mainstream, or also they're embedded in current political discourse. And I would really like, you know, both of you or maybe one of you to kind of reflect on what are your experiences in relation to this, again, the complexity in trying to engage in any kind of comparative analysis study when it comes to two forms of political violence, and what are the specific ramifications in terms of prevention and CVE in general.
Cynthia, do you want to take this from a research perspective and I can take it from a practice perspective?
Yes, please.
Sure. So what I can say is that one of the challenges from even though I think on the bottom up motivations across, as you pointed out, both on the Islamist side, let's say, and the extreme far right side, a lot of the same vulnerabilities exist. But one of the different key differences is on the top down side, what we would call the strategies and organizational tactics of the groups, the way they recruit. This is where there's tremendous variation. And so on the international or Islamist side, for the most part, jihadi terrorism, you have a much more hierarchical, much more organized groups of cells reporting to structure, claiming loyalty to or adherence to a particular individual or one group within that. Whereas on the far right side, much of the modern violence, the modern phenomenon of the violence is not coming through organized groups at all, but through actors that don't actually have any affiliation or attachment to a group, no membership in a group, but are nonetheless motivated by the same kind of global conspiracy of the Great Replacement, for example. And so that's why, now I'm speaking for myself rather than for the lab, but as a researcher, my new book, which I wasn't going to shout out, but I just had a book released this week called Hate in the Homeland, which focuses on the gateways. And I think that from an intervention perspective, we will do much better on the far right side if we look at the moments of entry and the places and spaces where people are exposed to this as a way to intervene. So what I suggest from a research perspective in that book is finding places that are the sites of early exposure, which we know from cross-national cases to be the mixed martial arts, for example, in Europe, Russia, Eastern Europe. Online cooking and lifestyle shows are a big area of growth, which is hard for people to understand, but DIY channels, wellness channels, all of these kinds of spaces where messages about purity come through, about organic food and territoriality, the blood and soil of the Nazi era, right? For example, that kind of messaging, homeschooling networks, places where there's kind of more reach into it. Now, this is much more difficult from a government perspective, I think, because of free speech issues, but from an educational and intervention perspective, where we understand how, from online gaming, for example, we know that statistic about a quarter of online gamers exposed. So what can we do to reach out to online gamers in an inoculation sense before they're exposed? So that's, I think, where we are trying to test some of the research on testing Kurt Braddock's inoculation methodology, which has been proven in the field. In the lab, we're now testing it in the field to see whether you can actually change the trajectory of how people react when they encounter it, with the assumption that they're going to encounter it, treating it more like a contagious virus than like a tumor that could be isolated, monitored, and excised from society, but something that almost anybody could be exposed to. And I think that's different than the way we have been treating jihadi or international Islamist forms of terrorism, because the organizational structure and the way that it spreads is different. So I would just suggest that as one alternative for the way we might approach it, with the understanding and the caveat that I understand that's more difficult from a government perspective because of this country's free speech protections. And what does that mean? How do you intervene at an early stage where nothing illegal is happening? And I think that is difficult, but from an intervention stage, I think it's really important.
I want to echo everything Cynthia just said. I don't think I could say it better myself. There's certainly quite a bit of diversity that should never be taken for granted. I completely agree. Targeting prevention where there's early exposure is a way to go. It's why we have teams working on online gaming, for example, right now. And also recognizing, as the other Brett mentioned, that component of parents and significant others reaching out for help. And Cynthia mentioned this as well, doing that education, doing that outreach, doing that awareness to your parents, to your peers, to your significant others or mentors who may be in that position to see behavior change over time and recommend that secondary intervention. So primary prevention where there's early exposure and public awareness for parents, peers, and mentors where there may be a need for secondary intervention.
Thank you both. I appreciate your insights, and I hope that we have opportunity to get into the impact and evaluation at a later point. Maybe we can organize a separate discussion just for that, to see what is actually the impact of a lot of campaigns, whether it's offline and online. But it's something that we'll keep in mind in the future as well. So it was a pleasure meeting you all and having you discuss a lot of interesting things from policy and programmatic perspective as well. We hope to have you in one of our future panels as well. So thank you again to all of you, and please stay tuned for our session number 3, when we are going to be discussing violent extremism in the context of the higher education institution in the United States. So thank you so much.